The Tale of Sleepy Joe and Orange Man. In the United States, a land beset by political chaos and civil unrest, two men held the reins of power. The first was Sleepy Joe, the sitting president, a man once full of promise who had now become a symbol of weariness. The second, Orange Man, the former president, a force of ego and ambition who, despite losing the throne, had never stopped grasping for more. It was late in the White House, the only sound the rustling of papers as Sleepy Joe sat behind his desk. His eyes were heavy, weighed down by the burden of a world in turmoil. But his thoughts remained sharp, focused on his final attempts to leave a legacy. Sanctions, tariffs on Russia, he muttered to himself, running his pen over the page. His advisors had pushed him to make these moves, aiming to hold Russia accountable for their interference in the global order. The decision would be costly, affecting European energy prices and hurting common citizens. But in Joe's mind, it didn't matter. He signed the order and left the room, content in the thought that history would have no choice but to recognize his strength, even if it meant rising global tensions and suffering for many. Across the country, in the Golden Towers of New York, Orange Man sat in his office, a picture of self-absorption. The world outside was burning, climate change, social unrest, a fractured economy. But to him, it was all noise. Power, fame, and control were all that mattered. "Canada! Tariffs! We'll make them pay," he said with a smirk, tapping his fingers on the desk. "The economy needs to be reshaped, and I'll be the one to do it." His announcement was nothing more than a show, a power play to win favor with his supporters and keep the spotlight on himself. The tariffs he imposed were a move to retaliate against perceived wrongs. But the truth was, it was all for the headlines, for the praise of his base. The workers in Canada and the struggling American families who would feel the impact, they were mere pawns in his game. "We need to make America great again," he declared, his voice reverberating through the media, drowning out the cries of those who would bear the burden of his policies. The economy teetered, inflation rose, and everyday people paid the price. But all Orange Man cared about was securing his place in the media and in history. While the world's powerful men played their games, a real tragedy unfolded in the West. The wildfires that ravaged California claimed lives, destroyed homes, and sent hundreds of thousands fleeing. The emergency services worked around the clock, while desperate families watched their homes and livelihoods burn. But inside their ivory towers, neither Sleepy Joe nor Orange Man paid the fires any heed. Joe remained focused on global politics, signing sanctions and declarations that only deepened the divide between nations. Orange Man, ever obsessed with himself, used the flames as just another talking point, distracting his followers with more rhetoric and power moves. The people of California suffered, and the country continued to burn. Not just in the fires, but in the hearts of those who watched the world crumble around them, abandoned by the very men who were supposed to lead them. As the wildfires raged on, a shift in the winds began. The fires, fed by dry conditions and reckless disregard, grew even more violent. What had started as a series of localized fires spread quickly, destroying entire communities, the flames swallowing up neighborhoods, homes, and everything in their wake. Meanwhile, Sleepy Joe was increasingly frail and distant. His tired eyes betrayed a sense of helplessness, as if he had long given up on the world. But the pressure kept building, and soon his weariness was compounded by a devastating stroke, one that forced him to step away from the seat of power. And as the fires grew higher, consuming more of California, the people's cries grew louder. The tragedy echoed through the land, yet the ego of Orange Man only grew. Ignoring the cries of those suffering, he continued to fuel the flames of division. The tariffs, the trade wars, the rhetoric, it all seemed so small compared to the raging infernos in the West. But then, as the fires claimed even more lives, the chaos reached a tipping point. The ground cracked under the weight of political and social disarray, and the very foundation of the nation began to shake. In a matter of days, the entire country felt the effects. The wildfires in California, which had consumed entire cities, were just one part of a larger, uncontrollable disaster. The escalating tensions between nations, fueled by Joe's sanctions and Orange Man's tariffs, had plunged the economy into a crisis of unimaginable proportions. Fuel shortages, rising costs, and collapsing trade markets crippled the economy. Soon, it was no longer about the individual moves of these two men. It was about the consequences of their neglect, their desire for power, and their refusal to recognize the pain of the people. The fires that had once been a tragic backdrop became a symbol of their failure, an unstoppable force fueled by neglect and ambition. In the end, the country burned. The fires, both literal and figurative, consumed everything in their path. The men who had once held the fate of the nation in their hands were nothing more than husks of their former selves. Sleepy Joe had faded into oblivion, his legacy marred by indecision and exhaustion. Orange Man, consumed by his own ego, found himself alone, his power meaningless in the face of a world falling apart. And as the ashes settled, the world could only wonder, what would have happened if those in power had cared for the people rather than their own legacies? The tragic end came not with a bang, but with the slow and painful collapse of everything they had built. The nation, once vibrant and full of hope, was left in ruins, its people scattered and broken as the flames continued to rise in the distance. The nation, once vibrant and full of hope, was left in ruins, its people scattered and broken as the flames continued to rise in the distance. The nation, once vibrant and full of hope, was left in ruins, its people scattered and broken as the flames continued to rise in the distance.